Hi, I'm Dwayne Brown. Tonight on KPBS Evening Edition, San Diego gets some encouraging news tonight worth about $14 million. And volunteers and community groups turn out to help San Diego's homeless reconnect.
I'm Amitha Sharma. As President Obama promotes his plan for immigration reform, there's a new call in San Diego for guest worker reform. And new laws were supposed to reform the banking industry after the financial meltdown. But one analyst says big banks are back to some bad habits.
An old-school airship could become the military's newest form of transportation. KPBS Evening Edition starts now.
KPBS Evening Edition is made possible by Joan and Erwin Jacobs and by
Hi, good evening. Thanks for joining us. Another about face from the state regarding San Diego's leftover redevelopment funds. Finance officials say the city can use up to $14 million for the renovation of Horton Plaza Park downtown. It's one of many projects the state had to approve after shutting down redevelopment agencies in 2011. Officials are reconsidering funding requests for other projects, including the convention center expansion downtown. Late last year, the state reversed a denial for funds for a permanent homeless shelter downtown. San Diego Housing Commission links resources with people in need, and they're located in the heart of the city downtown. Today, they put on their 7th annual Project Homeless Connect, a one-day resource fair that drew a large crowd of people to the community concourse. This is just a swipe of the estimated 1,100 homeless people living in and around downtown San Diego. Some are veterans, young people, seniors, and disabled. They've even brought their dogs, who were taken care of by Humane Society volunteers. When the guests enter Golden Hall, volunteers in purple T-shirts direct them to a slew of free services, from health screenings and flu shots to legal aid and housing counseling.
But then look around. You see nonprofit organizations, corporations from across the city here all day today to serve the homeless. And what you also see are hundreds of San Diegans who have volunteered and donated. So we have individuals who have donated bottles of water, first aid kits, moving home kits, shoes, clothing, and whatnot.
Volunteer stylists from Bellis, the Rescue Mission, and California Hair Design are working 4-hour shifts. This is what Joshua Schaffeld looked like when he sat down.
My older brother is 2 years older than me, and he has 3 kids right now.
Really?
Yeah.
He's getting a buzz cut after spending 6 months on the streets. He's originally from Oregon, lost his job and unemployment benefits, and eventually landed in San Diego.
I ended up down at the Bottoms.
That's where many homeless people are living, under a highway overpass downtown. And like the hundreds of people seeking help at this event, Sheffield wasted no time in taking advantage of the many services.
Yeah, I just got the haircut, I just got the flu shot, and I got my teeth cleaned.
Now he's looking for a place to live.
Where I stay someplace for a while, and then I kind of get bored of it.
He learned the city's permanent housing for homeless people will open soon downtown, and says he's going to spread the word.
I'll be checking it out. I'll be bringing my friends in to check it out, and I'll be spreading the word around to the fellow homeless people, trying to help them out too.
That's what Project Homeless Connect is all about. People helping people reconnect and hopefully turn their lives around. Last year, 941 people were helped by Project Homeless Connect in San Diego. They used computers for the first time to register folks this year, with a goal to serve at least 1,000 homeless. San Diego will continue with 11 civil cases against owners of medical marijuana clinics, while City Council works on a new law to let those clinics operate legally. Mayor Bob Filner says he will try to get a draft ordinance to council within 30 days. Gabrielle Giffords went back to Capitol Hill today. The former congresswoman, now an activist against gun violence, opened a Senate hearing with a call to action.
Be bold, be courageous. Americans are counting on you.
Today's hearing also included testimony from a top official with the National Rifle Association who rejected bans on certain assault weapons and high-capacity magazines. He says the government is failing to enforce existing gun laws. Well, first we heard from U.S. senators, then from President Obama. Now, a bipartisan group in the House is working on immigration reform. The lawmakers say they'll unveil their proposal in the next couple of weeks. The president took his immigration reform message to Spanish-language television today. He told Telemundo he wants a done deal in 6 months. He says politics are standing in the way rather than technical issues. And some immigration activists have expressed doubts about the president's reform plan, including the co-founder of the Minuteman Project.
This is going to essentially create more of the same problem. If we're going to grant amnesty to 15 to 30 million people who are here illegally now, we're going to be granting amnesty to 300 million who will follow them over the next several decades.
The president and Senate Republicans have both said there are 11 million undocumented immigrants in the U.S. Our Fronteras desk has wrapped up a 6-part series called Broken Border Immigration Reform in the Southwest. Amitha Sharma is in for Peggy Pico tonight with more on the series.
KPBS reporter Adrian Florido did the piece. He joins me now. Adrian, you took a look at San Diego County's agricultural community, which in recent years has had trouble finding enough workers. What's the labor situation now?
Well, I guess it depends on who you speak with. I was talking to Eric Ryerson, who's the director of the San Diego County Farm Bureau, and he says that in the last 3 or 4 years, since the economy kind of went down the tubes and since immigration enforcement has also been on the increase, it's been harder for farmers to find workers to basically pick their harvests. And they say pretty openly that a lot of the people that work on farms as agricultural workers here are undocumented people who use often falsified documents, and that because of this upsurge in immigration enforcement, that's been hard to do. So what they're saying is that they've had to leave fruit on the vines, they have had to scale back on the amount of crop that they produce, essentially.
So immigration reform is on the table now, and whenever reform is discussed, a guest worker program usually comes up. But theoretically, there is a guest worker program right now, but it's not used. Why?
There are all kinds of guest worker programs. One of them specifically is for farm workers, and it's called H-2A. And basically what it does is it allows basically any farmer in the U.S. Who has a need for farm workers, who can't find local labor to work on farms, to recruit temporary foreign workers. A lot of those workers come from Mexico, but what a lot of farmers say, including Eric Ryerson and other farmers I've spoken to here in San Diego, is that the program is just so cumbersome, so bureaucratic, that it makes it almost impossible to bring farmers in without a ton of investment, a ton of time, and a ton of red tape to navigate.
So what does Eric want to see?
Well, he and a lot of people in the farm lobby across the country want to see a much more streamlined, simplified guest worker program. So one proposal is to just create some kind of card, some kind of visa that gives people in Mexico, for example, who would come and work on farms, basically the ability to cross the border pretty freely whenever agricultural work is needed, and then require them to return home afterward.
Now, it appears that the Senate plan includes some type of program like this where it makes it easier for them to come and go. But is there a downside to workers to having a guest worker program?
There are so many different perspectives on this kind of program, right? From the farms, from the farm lobby side, they really just want the ability to bring in temporary, low-cost labor. From the workers and workers' advocate side, there's a lot of concern about the existing H-2A program being abusive to and exploitative of farm workers, because a farm worker, for example, can only come in on a visa sponsored by their employer. If they don't find good working conditions, or if they're underpaid or overworked, they can't switch employers. They have to stick with that person, or they can basically go home. For a lot of people who work on the farms who say are U.S. citizens, who may be older, middle-aged, bringing in younger guest workers puts a lot of pressure on them, because these younger workers who come in as temporary workers generally work faster, work harder, and these people have to work, keep up with them if they're local labor. And so what a lot of advocates want is really, well, some people don't want any guest worker program at all. They say that there are enough laborers here We just need to focus on legalizing the undocumented people already in the U.S. Other people, because they think that the political reality is there's going to be some kind of expansion of the guest worker program, really want to focus on more labor protections for workers.
So about those protections that they're seeking, how strong are these advocates who are lobbying for these workers? How much clout do they have?
Well, we've been able to see from the tons of advocacy that's been going on around the DREAM Act, around just getting immigration to be on the table in general this year, that advocates for workers, advocates for immigrants have a lot of political power, especially now that the Latino vote and the Latino community has become so much more powerful, as evidenced in the last election. So there are a lot of really kind of strong advocates out there doing this kind of advocacy, and they're hoping that they can influence the process this year.
And we've got to end it there. Adrian Florido, thank you so much for speaking to us today.
Thanks.
A San Diego company will help Libya identify thousands of bodies discovered in mass graves. Life Technologies in Carlsbad is providing equipment and know-how to make the project possible. KPBS Business and Environment reporter Eric Anderson is in the newsroom with the story. Eric, how did Life Technologies get involved in this?
Well, Dwayne, the San Diego area company got involved because it specializes in forensic DNA analysis. They've developed tools and techniques that allow them to arrive at a location, collect DNA samples, some from just bone fragments or degraded tissue. A chemical protocol is then used to test, filter, and separate unique DNA, and then technicians use software to match the discovered DNA with DNA from living relatives. It basically allows them to determine if the found bodies are people who have been reported missing.
And are Life Technology scientists actually going to Libya?
Well, no. What the local company is going to do is to provide the equipment and the training, and they're even considering bringing Libyan scientists here so they can teach them to do the forensic work in the field.
And in terms of demand, is there a huge demand for this type of service?
Well, yes, there is, Dwayne. Some people estimate there are as many as 20,000 bodies buried in mass graves around the country, grave sites that came into being during the 42-year rule of Muammar Gaddafi. And it says a lot about how this particular technology has developed, because researchers will be able to go to a mass grave that is decades old in some cases, identify those buried there. And the Libyan government says that it's going to give families of the missing some closure.
KPBS Business and Environment reporter Eric Anderson. It's been 4 years since the government's bailout of Wall Street. Despite reforms, most folks, including savvy investors, don't trust banks. USD law professor Frank Partnoy has written several books about Wall Street. He joins Amitha Sharma to talk about why public faith in banks is so low.
Professor Partnoy, you just co-authored a piece in the Atlantic Monthly, which explains some of the mistrust that Americans feel toward their banks. In that piece, you studied Wells Fargo's financial statements. What did you find?
We found that Wells Fargo is just as opaque as the other banks that people have become scared of. That when we worry about JP Morgan or Goldman Sachs or Morgan Stanley and all these risks that have come out. Last year, JP Morgan disclosed this $2 billion loss that its CEO called a tempest in a teapot, and then suddenly it was a $6 billion loss. And this was all because of trading at these banks. Then, in fact, Wells Fargo has many of the same problems, that it has over $1 trillion of derivatives, that it has over $2 trillion of these special purpose entities, now known as variable interest entities, which are exactly the same kinds of devices that Enron had exposure to before it collapsed.
And why did you pick Wells Fargo?
We picked Wells Fargo because picking one of those other banks would be kind of like shooting fish in a barrel. The people already knew about those risks. And Wells Fargo is widely regarded as one of the most conservative, best-run banks. It has the highest market value of any bank. It's where I have my checking and savings account. It's a very trusted bank, you know, the venerable stagecoach back in the West protecting all of our gold. That's what people think about Wells Fargo. And so we wanted to go through in meticulous detail and understand exactly what Wells Fargo is telling investors about its risks, and its disclosures were quite surprising to us.
And those disclosures, did you take your findings to Wells Fargo? What did they say?
Yes, we did. We asked Wells Fargo if we could speak to senior executives. They said no. We asked them very specific questions about each of the items that we talked about and asked for additional references, and they pointed us back to the annual report, back to the financial statements. So we would ask a detail about these Enron-esque transactions, and they would say simply, we believe that all of those are answered in the financial reports themselves. And of course, our view was that they weren't.
And when you say Enron-esque transactions, you're talking about devices that are used to hide debts. Those devices are still being used by most banks, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct, and in large numbers. So these are very, very similar entities where the bank only owns a sliver of it, but there are huge potential liabilities, and all of those are off the balance sheet. So that if you just look at the financial statements, sort of like a small business has assets and liabilities, if you do that for a bank, you'll only see a tiny fraction of what the bank's potential exposure is, because there are all these other liabilities that are off the balance sheet.
So the crux of the problem is the accuracy of these financial statements. Yet in 2010, President Obama signed into law the Dodd-Frank Financial Reform Bill. What went wrong with financial reform?
There are a couple of things that went wrong. One is that the enormous complexity of the regulations that came out of Dodd-Frank, that's taken years to implement, and many of the regulations still are not implemented. But the other problem was that we didn't target this issue of transparency and disclosure. That's what we did in the aftermath of the 1929 crash. We developed these laws in the 1930s that were focused on transparency, disclosure, and we had decades of robust economic growth, and we didn't have these problems with banks. And one of the things that didn't happen in Dodd-Frank was the focus on disclosure and transparency. So there simply weren't requirements for banks to disclose worst-case scenarios or any of these risks. And so it shouldn't be surprising now, 5 years after the collapse, that banks are basically disclosing the same kinds of information they were before the crisis.
And what does the banking lobby have to do with the fact that there aren't those requirements, despite reforms?
Well, they're very powerful, obviously, and they don't have any interest in disclosing these details. Although some banks now say that if collectively they would get together to disclose the details, that they might be willing to do that. But no bank like Wells Fargo or JP Morgan is going to stick its neck out and start disclosing this kind of information unless everyone else is disclosing it simultaneously. And that requires new law.
Now, you say that senior bank executives should face the threat of prosecution in the same way that chief executives face that in other sectors of the economy. Yet, not one bank executive was criminally prosecuted for their role in the 2008 financial crisis. Is there any kind of real enforcement on Wall Street?
Well, there is some enforcement, but I think what you've just cited is one of the reasons so many average Americans are angry about the aftermath of the crisis, that there was conduct that was obviously criminal, that it can't be the fact that the optimal number of people to go to jail after the financial crisis is 0, that some of these bank executives did things, certifying financial statements, financial fraud, selling financial instruments to people who didn't understand them, that some of that has to be punishable criminally. But one of the problems that we've seen is that the prosecutors look at these cases and they feel they can't win them. That even the very, very best prosecutors in Washington and at U.S. attorneys' offices throughout the country look at them and say, we're going to lose. And I think what that signals to us is that we need new laws that will strengthen enforcement so that the next time this happens, that they'll be able to bring those kinds of cases.
And we have to close it there. Frank Partnoy, thank you so much for speaking to us today.
Thank you.
Home sales and prices have been going up. Now, a real estate tracking firm says sales of million-dollar homes hit a 5-year high in California last year. DataQuick says nearly 27,000 homes sold for at least $1 million. 345 of those homes were in La Jolla, where the most expensive home went for $15 million. The Defense Department has all kinds of planes and helicopters. Now it's looking at adding blimps to its fleets. It's already tested spy blimps, and the Pentagon has ordered a prototype of a cargo blimp designed to land like a helicopter in places where nothing else can land. The story from Raquel Maria Dillon of the Associated Press.
It looks like a Martian spaceship. But here, hiding out in this World War II-era hangar in Orange County, California, might be the future of flight.
This vehicle is a scaled-down prototype model for our 66-ton cargo lifting vertical takeoff aircraft.
This airship is about 270 feet long and weighs in at 36,000 pounds. 2.5 Goodyear blimps would fit inside. But don't call it a blimp or a Zeppelin, because this lighter-than-air vehicle doesn't get inflated and has a rigid structure inside.
The skin of this vehicle is made out of a high-tech mylar. Inside, there's a carbon fiber structure, and then inside of that, there are balloons that hold the helium.
Helium is lighter than air, so the airship functions like a submarine, taking on more air to sink and land.
It allows the vehicle to be heavier and set down on the ground. And then when we want to become lighter than air, we release that air.
The groundbreaking feature feature of this airship is that it takes off vertically like a helicopter and can unload while hovering above the ground.
You could take this vehicle and go to destinations that have been destroyed, where there's no ports, no runways, stuff like that. This vehicle could go in there, offload the cargo, even if there's no infrastructure or no direct landing site for it to land on. This vehicle could offload its whole payload.
In all, 66 tons of cargo can fit inside. The airship could help humanitarian relief efforts and supply forward bases in hostile territory. That's why the Pentagon and NASA have invested $36 million in the construction of this prototype. It can fly, barely, floating just above the floor, still in the hangar. For the aerospace engineers who built it, that first test flight was an unforgettable moment.
It was an incredible, exciting day because for me, I realized that I put a little dot in the line of aviation history. It was a little dot where something that has never been demonstrated before, now it's feasible.
Soon the team will bring the airship outside as they further refine the Aeroscraft and prepare to build the next model, which will be twice as big. Raquel Maria Dillon, The Associated Press, Tustin, California.
A leading expert on population growth says overpopulation is real, and he's offering solutions. He sat down with Amitha Sharma to explain the cause and effects.
The Earth's population has nearly doubled in the last 100 years. Add climate change, lack of land to grow food, and overconsumption to the mix, and life as we know it on the planet appears to be in peril. Joining me is William Ryerson, CEO of the Population Institute and contributing author to the new book, Life on the Brink, Environmentalists Confront Overpopulation. Bill, welcome.
Thank you for having me on.
Oh, you're welcome. The world's population is 7 billion now. It's projected to grow by another billion over the next 13 years. Most people associate overpopulation with places like Africa, India, and China. Bring this topic home for San Diegans.
The U.S. has the third highest increment in its population of any country on the planet. We're growing by about 3 million a year. And California is a major recipient of that growth. The car population here, as a result of population growth, is growing by 1,000 new automobiles a day. So this state, and particularly the southern part of the state, is feeling the impact on its infrastructure of all of these additional people.
Now, birth rates in Europe and the United States and China are actually lower, but they remain high in places like India. What's the key factor?
The key factor is the status of women. Girls are in places like Niger and in some parts of India are being put into marriages as children. 25,000 girls underage per day being married against their will.
And what's the reason?
Girls are seen as an asset if they're sold into marriage and earn a dowry, but otherwise as a liability. And so, in fact, one of the things that another organization I had, Population Media Center, is trying to do is to promote, through soap operas, girls' education, getting people to send their daughters to school, which, of course, delays marriage and childbearing, as well as making them much better mothers.
Now, there are other effects of overpopulation, and one of them is climate change. And yet you say that we are in retreat when it comes to fighting climate change. And in fact, polls say that fewer Americans actually believe in climate change than did 4 years ago. What happened?
Certainly what has happened is a huge misinformation campaign doubting the science that is almost universally believed by serious climate scientists. Because of vested interests that don't want to stop what they're doing now with the use of fossil fuels. But with the storms that have occurred in the last year, particularly Sandy on the East Coast, there are a lot of people who are starting to rethink their doubts about climate change because we are feeling its impact. And in places like Southeast Asia, we're actually involved in doing programs helping people to adapt to rising seawaters and other effects of climate change because it is really impacting the way people are living.
Overpopulation and climate change aren't the only factors here. Overconsumption is also a problem. I read somewhere that if the entire world consumed as much as the United States did, we'd need 5 more Earths. Exactly. How do you get people to consume less?
It's a very difficult question because there's no unmet demand for reducing people's lifestyle. But we are, as a human endeavor, way beyond what the long-term carrying capacity of the planet is when we run out of oil, coal, and gas, which will happen in this century. And so we will have to reduce our consumption. We cannot continue to live the American lifestyle and have the rest of the world aspiring to do so. As you said, even now we'd need 5 more planets. There are several things that have to be done. One is at a policy level, forcing higher efficiency standards with regard to energy use and various other policies that can help to reduce overall consumption. Also, much more investment in family planning, because addition of 225,000 people a day to the world's population is part of what is driving increased consumption around the planet. So all of these issues are important.
Very quickly, why isn't there more dialogue about this?
It's a difficult issue. It certainly involves, and I found it somewhat delightfully controversial for the 41 years I've been working in the population field. People, of course, know that population growth is a sexually transmitted condition, so it has to do with sex, it has to do with family planning, it has to do with abortion in some people's minds, it has to do with immigration. I mean, all of these issues are controversial. Put them all together and you really have a boiling pot.
And Bill, I've got to wrap it up right there, but I do want to remind our viewers that you will be speaking tonight at San Diego State at 7 p.m.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you.
Well, if you like today's sunshine, you can look forward to more of it. The Weather Service says sunny through the end of the week. Temperatures will stay warm in the inland valleys, and it will be a little cooler in the mountains. The desert may see some clouds by Friday. You can find tonight's stories and download the KPBS app, all on our website, kpbs.org/evening edition. Thanks for joining us. You have a great night.